We don't know exactly how many planes were taken out. The Ukrainians claim 41. They, as antagonists in both sides of wars, always tend to, maximize the numeric exploits. So we can confirm probably almost half of that number. It'll probably go up. We'll see. But the point remains the same. In 3.5 years now of this brutal war, this is by far the most spectacular strike that has been seen by either side. This is David versus Goliath, and little Ukraine proves that they have the ability with drones that cost between $300 and $400, and only a couple hundred of them are able to take out individual strategic nuclear bombers that cost over $100 million for the Russians to build. And by the way, which they don't have the military capability to build today. So we've never seen an asymmetric strike like this be pulled off against a major nuclear power. It's never happened. And there are, I think, big implications. There are big implications for warfighting going forward. There's big implications for Putin and what he decides to do and how he responds, the future of the Russia-Ukraine war. There's big implications for the United States and the role that President Trump is or is not going to play as a consequence. And it is essential, I think, to get deep under the hood around all of those things and not just rely on the, oh my God, look at what just happened of the headlines.
I think the phrase asymmetric warfare is really key for us to understand here, as you say. So I was reading that this operation took about 1.5 years to plan. It was obviously extremely daring. But as we do try to understand the implications of what happened here, how do you think Ukraine actually managed to pull this off, playing, as you say, the David role in this David versus Goliath story?
The Ukrainians have been working to develop their own homemade military capabilities. I mean, you see how much Europe is now saying we need to move to 3 to 4 to even 5% of GDP spend on defense. It's not existential for them. This is the only thing that matters for Ukrainians. It matters more than eating well. It matters more than educating your kids. It's whether or not your country and therefore you have a future after the Russians invaded. And so they're putting everything they can into building military capabilities. And they don't have as many people and they don't have as much money, but they are better educated. And they also have access to a very capable global Ukrainian diaspora. And I've met many young Ukrainian, ethnically Ukrainian technologists from Silicon Valley, from Canada, from Europe, who have worked with the Ukrainian military virtually, and many who have traveled to Ukraine and resettled in Ukraine to help them there. And that, in addition to some of the money that's been provided by Europe and the United States, has helped the Ukrainians to build a world-class, perhaps Israel would be also, probably one or two, one of the best drone capabilities, military drone capabilities in the world. And that is exactly what just happened. They hid these drones in the top of containers that were brought into Russia on trucks. Those containers were then sent all over Russia, some of which were very deep inside Russia. And then all at once, in one day, or at least the ones that we've now seen, maybe there are more that are still in hiding, they were ordered, directed to be deployed against Russian military bases and other infrastructure. And I mean, this is not just close to the Russian front lines with Ukraine. I mean, there was a military base that is on the Mongolian border. We're talking thousands and thousands of miles away from the Ukrainian front, and they were able to destroy advanced Russian strategic bombers in that base. It's unprecedented. It reminds me a bit of what we saw with Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah, because Hezbollah, we had for many years always been saying this is the most powerful non-state armed forces in the world, and that Israel had to be very careful not to get involved in a war with them because it would be incredibly dangerous for Israel's own national security. And then over a matter of days, we find out that Israel has decapitated their leadership, completely taken out their communications systems, and destroyed their military infrastructure, critically weakening Iran's geopolitical position in the Middle East as a consequence, and leading to what is now the most progress that Trump has had in any diplomatic effort around the world, US-Iran, which no one would have expected a few months ago, but started with a change in asymmetric warfare that Israel was able to perpetrate against Hezbollah. This is now happening between Ukraine and Russia, obviously on a much more significant scale and with global, not just regional consequences, Helen.
So at the top, you said that we need to talk about three things in particular, or dive into them. And one of them, of course, is Putin and the Russian response to this. Now, it seems, and as you say, reports are differing as to the number of planes that were actually lost, but it seems like Russia has lost about a third of its strategic bombers in the raid so far. That's more than $7 billion in damage. I'm also curious, you said that they can't rebuild these planes. Really stupid question, but why not?
So the Russians rely on a triad, as the Americans do, to deliver a nuclear arsenal in the event of the unthinkable, a nuclear war. You have ballistic missiles, ICBMs, you have submarines that are nuclear capable, and you have the bomber fleet. The bomber fleet is the oldest of the three legs of the stool. And it's really the least important. It's the last resort. It's what happens if there was a first strike by the Americans and NATO, and you take out some of the most advanced capabilities, and the bombers have been scrambled, they're in the air, and they're meant to be, something that you can deploy if you have to. If in the worst case. So it's a second strike capability is the way they think about it. Now, those bombers are Soviet era. The Russians are not making them anymore, and they certainly can't do a lot of the replacement parts now because so much of their present military efforts are going towards fighting a very different kind of war. But these strategic bombers are important. They are a part of ongoing arms control agreements. They are clearly part of the nuclear balance that the U.S. has against the Russians and NATO has against the Russians. And if the Ukrainians can do this, and clearly Ukraine wanted to take out all of them, the intention was to basically cripple one leg of the nuclear triad and also one leg of Russia's ability to use conventional missiles against Ukraine. And Ukraine is running low of Patriot missile battery artillery. And so, therefore, they need to have successes there. That's why they don't have so many of them. And that's why they can't rebuild them. So just to give you kind of some context on that.
Thank you so much. So clearly, whatever the final numbers, this has been extraordinarily damaging for Russia. And in response, on Sunday, they launched, as I've heard it, 472 drones, 3 ballistic missiles, and 4 cruise missiles at Ukraine. What should we also expect from Russia going forward? And do you think that Ukraine is actually ready for it?
Ukraine is ready for everything at this point. The Russians have not shown restraint in a way that the Ukrainians have. Let's keep in mind, Helen, that the fact that Ukraine was able to do this meant that Ukraine could have deployed those drones against Russian civilians and civilian architecture. They could have killed hundreds, if not thousands, of Russian civilians in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, and they didn't, and they haven't. And the Russians are the ones that have historically, for the last 3.5 years, launched their own missiles and drones and bombers and attacked everything they can find that moves. in Ukraine. They're the ones targeting civilians. So the Ukrainians are ready for this. But we have to think about what Putin is going to do. And we need to put ourselves in Putin's head here. Why is it that Putin has believed that the longer this war goes on, the better for him? And what might Putin's vulnerabilities be in his head? Because he's the one that's making the decisions himself. And those are two separate questions. So let me try to address both of them for you. First, why has Putin believed that the war, the longer it goes, the better for him? And look, I think part of it is that Russia's military is bigger. Part of it is that he doesn't care as much about his own civilians. Putin runs a dictatorship. The Ukrainians have to worry much more about popular response. I mean, they've got their conscription age was 27. It was really hard just to bring it down to 25. Putin doesn't have to worry about that kind of thing. If you're Putin, you can keep raising thousands and hundreds of thousands of young men, and the Russian people can't really do anything to you. They don't have an ability to raise their voices in response. So he thinks he can throw more people at it. He can have stronger political stability. He's got a bigger economy and a bigger war economy. He also thinks that the Europeans will lose interest. He has seen a number of European governments less willing to provide support. And most importantly, he's seen the Americans very inconsistent, much more internally divided over why it is that they're supporting Ukraine, even willing to suspend for a period of time intelligence and defense equipment at a time that they were not willing to threaten Russia credibly with bigger consequences and more sanctions. So if you're Putin, you've believed that the longer you stick with this war, the weaker the Ukrainians will get, the more the Europeans will be divided, and the more likely the Americans are going to walk away. And even with Trump getting embarrassed by Putin stringing him along, there's nothing that Trump has shown Putin that has changed that view. So the big question is whether Ukraine, showing that they do have some cards to play, that they can actually damage Russia in ways that certainly Putin had never considered possible. And what else might they be able to do? How might they be able to weaken Russia critically on the global stage, its military capabilities? How might they make Putin look vulnerable with his own leaders, showing that he misjudged critically Ukraine's lack of capabilities? Might they even be able to assassinate Putin? Might they be able to come after him individually? So those are all things that would make it more likely that Putin would negotiate in better faith, that he might be willing to actually engage more with Ukraine and bring us to a ceasefire. Of course, there have been some meetings in the last 24 hours, and we should come back and talk about that. But I want to get to the second point, because that's what might make Putin feel like he needs to engage more. That's the optimistic point. But there's a pessimistic point, which is Putin has to also ask himself, why is it that the Europeans have been willing to continue to provide more and more weapons and allow the Ukrainians to strike deep inside Russia? And, there's some debate over whether or not Trump was told in advance by Zelensky that these strikes were going to occur. I actually think Trump did know. I think, first of all, the Ukrainians have shown that they really need that intelligence. And also the Ukrainians have capitulated to Trump because they know they can't anger him that much. So, you've seen that the Ukrainians accepted without any conditions a 30-day ceasefire because Trump demanded it. They accepted his critical minerals deal and pushed it through their own parliament, even though they were deeply uncomfortable, because Trump demanded it. I have a hard time seeing Ukraine going ahead with these strikes and surprising Trump. I do, especially because they came right after Trump was really angry and displayed that because Putin was engaging in all of these strikes against Kiev, killing all of these civilians, and Trump came out saying that. So if you're Putin, you see that the NATO seems to be very comfortable allowing, not only giving Ukraine all of these weapons and this intelligence that's facilitating Ukraine to take actions against Russia's strategic nuclear forces. So if you're Putin, what have you done wrong that has allowed NATO to persist in their belief that they can get away with that? And here, the issue is something that we shouldn't be comfortable with, which is that Putin has to be thinking that he has not at all effectively deterred NATO. He has made them think that he is weak, that he won't respond adequately to them, that when he threatens Sweden and Finland and says that if you join NATO, there will be hell to pay, and then they join NATO and he does nothing, he looks weak. And when he tells the Germans, if you provide tanks and if you allow these weapons to go long range into Russia, there'll be hell to pay, and he does nothing against them, nothing credible. So I fear that there's also, just as there is a part of Putin that now sees that he is in a position where he might need to negotiate for a ceasefire, there's also a part of Putin that feels like he's in an environment where he needs to show that he's much tougher, that he's much more willing to exact pain on NATO than he has been historically, that there will be real consequences, especially for President Trump, who he knows is very scared of World War III, is very scared of getting into a war himself. And of course, if the optimistic take is that Russia is now more likely to go into a ceasefire, the pessimistic take is that Russia is now much more likely to escalate severely. And what that means, I fear, is more likely to consider a use of a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine. That's why this is so important. It's so critical that we really think all of this through and we get it right.
That is deeply unsettling, obviously. The Bremer take on all of that, if you're not playing optimist and you're not playing pessimist, where do you think we really are? And who is in the position, therefore, of trying to prevent nuclear disaster or this spilling into a bigger war? Is that Trump?
The realistic take is that this is an escalation, but it's not a game-changing escalation yet. That Putin will be careful, more careful about his forces than he has been. He will be more respectful of Ukraine's capabilities than he has been, and that he will up the attacks on Kiev and exact more civilian damage to Ukrainians around the country. He'll try to assassinate some senior leaders, some major defense leaders, that kind of thing. Maybe he'll try to pull off something spectacular against Ukrainians officials when they visit other countries, that kind of thing. But he doesn't seriously consider a nuke because he knows that would not just radically alienate and unify the Europeans. And he doesn't know what it will do with Trump, even though he's probably his sense that it will make Trump more distant and hands-off and try to end the war than fight against Russia. But he also knows that it will seriously antagonize his most important ally, and that is China. The Chinese really don't want the Russians to make this worse, and they would be very, very opposed to him using a nuclear weapon. And they've told him that historically. So I think he's loath to use it, but I understand that, if that was a 1% likelihood, maybe it's not 30 or 40 right now, but it's not 1. It's 5, it's 10, it's 20. And these are numbers that should be unthinkable, and they're not. Now, I want to say one more thing. What realist Ian is thinking right now. Realist Ian remembers Mr. Prigozhin, who you and I have spoken about in the past, when the head of the Wagner Group, one of the most important advisors to Putin, decided to go on a suicide run and took his senior most trusted troops and led a column of tanks from the Ukrainian front up to Moscow against Putin. And I mean, we all knew it was a suicide run. We all knew there was no way he could end up alive after that. But what had happened was Prigozhin was put into a corner, into a no-win situation where anything he did meant that he was going to end up in jail or dead. And what we have to understand is that when we're fighting a war between Russia and Ukraine and a proxy war between Russia and NATO, and the stakes are getting higher, and Ukraine's own asymmetric capabilities are getting greater, and Ukraine is absolutely willing. If they had a shot at Putin, they would take it in a second. If they had the ability to critically destroy Russia's warfighting capabilities, they would do it in a second. And NATO is helping them. We have to understand that if Putin ever got into a position in his headspace like Prigozhin was, either because of external threat to him or internal threat to him, he's not going to pull a Gorbachev where he, sort of steps down without a fight. No, Putin would go down with guns blazing. And absolutely, that means that nuclear use has gotten much closer today than it has been when I was growing up in the arms control age, in the day after age of the Cold War in the 70s and 80s. This is a much more dangerous environment than that. And the Russia-Ukraine war is the tip of the spear for what a major global war might eventually turn into.